I'm a boat builder from the Cotswolds in the UK, and I'm building a boat called Temptress, designed by Michel Berriere and kitted by myself to be built utilising the latest in CAD design, CNC cutting and modern epoxy wood construction. In this video I'm building another one of the boat's huge laminated timbers to go in. That's going to be the keel, this big beast that sits in the middle here. It's a big heavy timber, and I'll be building that and getting that installed in place. We've got a number of things to look at in the video, so we're going to do some scarf joints. I'm using the CNC machine to cut those. We're going to be doing some lamination. I'm going to show you a new little segment which we've got on the website, which is an area for people with boat building plans to get access to information. So we're going to use that to access the 3D model to take a look at the keel. We're going to do a segment on mixing epoxy and how we do that correctly for lamination work, and there's all sorts of shaping, hand tool and power tool work to do as well. Lots of stuff to do with building this big timber and getting it in place. So let's get started. First of all, I need the stock down from upstairs to get going. So I'm using utility for the keel, very kindly sawn for me and sized for me by Sykes Timber. So we've got this slightly oversized, and you'll see the reason for that once we get further into lamination. So the first job really is to get all of the laminates correct lengths and do all the scarf joints to get them joined together, so we've got nice full runs for when it comes to bonding these all together in one big piece. Now, we took a brief look in the previous video at a CNC scarf joint, a method for cutting these scarves really quickly. I've been utilising that for all the joints throughout the keel, and I have to say this process works really nicely indeed. So here you can see me just lining up the end of a piece of stock, and then I'm going to find where the scarf joint is in the other piece and mark the end point for where the two meet. Now, because of the way that the machine cuts the joint, it can also actually cut the stock as well as cutting the joint at the same time. So I just feed it into the machine and put that line up to the end mark, which you can see on the supporting timbers there. Knock that down into place with a nice tight fit, and then screw it down just to hold it in position as it cuts. Then I run the program, and around about 90 seconds later, this spits out a nice pre-cut nibbed scarf joint for me. And you can see it's cut that board off for me as well there, so everything's cut to size. Probably the best thing about this process and about using the CNC machine is that not only is that 90 seconds to cut the joint, but whilst the machine's cutting the joints, I'm preparing the stock for the next lamination layer. So we work very well as a team, the two of us, and it's really nice to just have that going in the background whilst I can be getting the other parts ready. So to understand the stock that we're going to actually need to build the laminations for this keel, let's take a look at one of the new features that I've just launched on the website for analysing the 3D models for our boat designs. So we've got a new feature on the website, which is going to be the new way in which people can access the resources for any of the boat building plans from our catalogue that they have purchased. So we're going to use that to take a look at what laminations I'm going to need for the keel on Temptress. Now, you'll find that under the build tab on the website, and the new function is called the dry dock. So we'll click on that, and you'll see that takes us into a list of all the boat plans. Now, access to this will be granted following a purchase of the boat plan, so you'll be able to sign into your account and then access this area of the website. So we'll click on Temptress and we'll go into there. And you can see that that page loads us up with some resources for Temptress. So we've got two 3D models here, and we'll come back and take a look at those in just a second. We've got all of our file downloads, so this is where you'll download everything that you need, such as timber material lists, consumable lists, all your drawings, all your DXF files for cutting your parts. You can download your personal build license. We've got hardware price lists and some links to getting kits cut if you wish to have yourself a boat building kit cut by us. Then down beneath that, we've got various different resources that you can refer to if you've got any questions about the build process throughout your building journey. So the primary thing that you're going to want to do here is to utilize the 3D models, and we've got some really great 3D viewers here that you can use, and this is permanently linked to my latest model within Fusion, so these are always going to be updated with the latest version of the boat. So you've got two 3D models here. You've got this constructional model that shows you all the jigs, fixtures and assembly of the hull. And then you've got the hull and mechanical model here, which shows you the planking, everything for the cockpit, all the things like the dashboard arrangement and the engine setup as well. Exhaust runs, engine mounts, everything that we've designed is in there. For the purpose of this video, we're going to take a look at how many laminations I need for the keel. So let's take a look at the constructional model. The first thing to do is to fire this up into full screen mode so that we can look at it properly. And you can see that we can navigate around this really nice and easily. If we bring up the model browser button here, you can see we've got all the different components of the construction down there. And if we click on any one of those, it's going to isolate that and allow us to drill in and just analyze the particular parts that we need. We can expand that and go even further, so we can look at the stem alone if we want to. And I'm going to go for the keel for this one because that's what I'm working on. Now I always do my laminated layers within the plans in opposing material colors. This just allows you to count those laminations really nice and quickly, and you can see here that we need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a little slither of 6 up forward there. So for the most part, I'm going to laminate this keel with 5 layers, and then what I'll probably end up having to do is just bond an extra little slither on the forward section there, but we can see where that's going to run to and from. So that's a quick look at the new dry dock section of the website. Hopefully that's going to be a really useful resource for boat builders that have bought plans from us. If you've already bought a set of plans, then you should very soon be getting an email with access to get into this section of the site and use the new 3D model viewers. Hopefully they'll be really useful. So I need 5 lamination layers for my keel, so let's get and build those. So with all my scarves cut, I'm ready to start gluing up, and I'm going to do this vertically. Now this is a little technique that Andrew Burge taught me when he was over working with me for some time. I always used to do scarves flat, but actually when you got a stack of them, doing them vertically works really well. So you'll see that in just a second. We're doing a 2-step bonding process here. We're essentially gluing a large portion of end grain with these scarves, so everything gets wetted out first with unthickened epoxy. Then the joint gets a thickened epoxy applied to it once that has slightly tacked up. I'm using the fine edge of a West System notch spreader to give me a really nice even glue coverage on this joint as well. This can then get assembled vertically. And it really helps here that the planer and my workbench are the same height. So I've just put some blocks in there just to lift them off slightly, but then I can run this nice and straight. So doing them vertically in this way allows me to make sure that the boards remain nice and straight and that we haven't got any skews within the scarves. Even with these CNC cut nibbed scarves, that can still occasionally happen. Clamping things in a big stack like this as well also prevents the slippage between the joints, because you can clamp multiple boards together, and that helps to stop things from spreading. So we put a small piece of polythene in between each layer to stop the layers sticking to each other, and then we can clamp things up. If you're lucky enough to be able to stack all of your scarves in one pack together, then you can position them all together and just do one clamp. Because these are distributed at various points throughout the laminations, I don't manage to get them all in one clump together, but you can see there's a big block in the center there where I did manage to get a group together. If not, there's a little bit of juggling with removing clamps and getting all the parts in one block. But this method works really well and you get nice straight scarf joints. So here I'm gluing up a big panel. This is going to go in the aft end of the keel. There's a section of the keel where it gets thicker, and you'll see where that goes in just a minute. This is a technique that I used to use for gluing up panels when we did furniture some years ago, and it's quite a quick and easy way to not have to include things like biscuits to get the panels equally aligned. So I lay these flat on the bench with some large flat sash clamps, and then I'll just go over the joint lines and I'll tap them back flat as I put the clamps back on. You can just run your finger over the little join between the panel edges here and tap things down, tighten the clamps as you go. And it's a really quick, easy way to get yourself a flat panel glued up like this. This is pretty much the finished thickness, so I don't want to lose a great deal of material off this when I size it, so it's got to be fairly flat. And a couple of passes through the sander and I can get this down to the thickness it should be, which is pretty much as it is, but I just clean up all the glue as well. Then I can start to mark out the shape of this part that I need for the additional thickness in the aft end of the keel. So we're now ready to start to glue up the laminates. I give everything a really coarse sand, so I'm using a 40 grit disc here just to make sure that the bonded faces are nicely keyed up and those scarves are perfectly flattened out as well. Then I can start to sort the laminates into the order that I want, and this is really about arranging the joints so that they're staggered throughout layers in the keel and that you haven't got two in the same area right next to each other. And then also about finding the nicest face that I want to see within the finished boat. So I'll put that on the inside, and then I'll create the stack to be what I need. Then just to make sure that I keep that in order, I'm going to mark those up so that they don't get muddled up whilst we do the glue up process. Once I'm happy with that arrangement, I can then start to load these into place on the boat, because that's where I'm going to do this lamination. And this is already quite a wieldy and heavy piece of timber arrangement, as you can see. So my laminates are in place, 5 in total. I've got an extra timber in place there, which is just going to make up the additional thickness of the keel, so it's thicker from the transom right through to here, and that is going to be this piece that you've just watched me make. Now everything's over width at the moment. I always do this with laminations. This is the only way you can really get clean and tidy laminations, is to go over width with the stock and then come down. So the keel is currently, I think, 120mm wide, and it needs to be 100mm finished. So of course I can't lay it in the notches down the keel line to laminate it. It won't fit in the notches at the moment, so I'm going to make up some blocks that will sit into these, and we'll transfer that notch up and mean that I can laminate the keel just above its final resting place, then bring it down to size and then drop it in. And this little bit here is going to account for the difference of the extra timber, which is also too wide at the moment. So we'll get some blocks cut, we'll get that in, and then I'm hoping to laminate this in place. So that you can see the standoff blocks. So this is just lifting the edge of the notches all throughout the keel up a little bit higher so that I can laminate over width up above, and then we'll drop this in once I've got it finally sized. It really helps having everything pre-CNC shaped here, because all of these notches are at the correct height and the correct angle ahead of making the keel. So then we can get onto lamination. Now if you watched my previous video on two-step bonding, you'll have seen some of the processes that we've utilised already with bonding the scarves. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the process of the lightly thickened epoxy on both faces. I use this for big lamination stacks when I've got to get parts together and we don't really have the time to be able to wet out each face individually. This process works really well for big stuff like this, and if you remember, this is what I did for the lamination of the stringers. We'll take a little look at exactly how to mix up the epoxy for this process very shortly. Now, this is a definite time crunch. It was quite hot in the workshop on this day. Unfortunately, I only had West System 105-205, which is the faster hardener, so I was really up against the clock with this to get all of this glued up and clamped up before things started to kick. But I just about managed to get it done, and it was all good, but gets a little bit stressful when the glue clock is ticking. So a clamp applied sideways here across the laminates is going to help to just prevent slippage between the layers, and you can see that I've done this diagonally so that I'm actually spanning all of the layers here with the face of the clamp. Now we've got a little bit of extra width with these timbers here, which is going to help for that cleanup process, but we still want to get these as close as we can to all being nice and parallel, otherwise we may end up with low spots that we can't clean up without ending with an undersized keel. So the occasional little clamp across the laminates just helps to keep things pulled straight here, and that can actually be removed once we get the clamps in the downward position. So pretty much every frame here I'm able to clamp down onto that keel filler, and then I'm using some clamps with blocks intermediately in between those just to make sure that all the laminates are nicely pulled down. So that's glued up. One big laminated keel. Pretty much cleaned out my entire clamp rack on that. You pretty much just keep putting them on until you run out of them. Just got a few little dregs left there, the ones that very rarely get used. But looking good, got a nice even squeeze out all along every glue line there. And that's definitely what I'm looking for. If you're building one of these, I would say, to be honest, you probably don't want any less clamps than that. You're going to need to be clamping at this sort of interval with blocks to get those laminations down nice and tight. So there's a little bit of an insight for you. You're going to want quite a few clamps for this. And got a pretty good glue line. There's a couple of little bits you might be able to see just here. We've got a slight little gap there. Ideally what I want to see is a nice little bead of glue like this all the way along every single glue line. That means I've got good full contact and coverage. Just like that. So I might just give those clamps there a little bit of a tweak just to get that down a bit tighter. But pretty pleased with how that's looking. So the following morning all of those clamps can be removed, and then we can start to think about getting the keel back out the boat and get it cleaned up. And there's a little look into roughly the amount of clamps you're probably going to want to do a lamination this size and get it nice and neat. They all go back on the rack, and yes, I do have to arrange my clamps by type and size. It's just one of those things that otherwise very much annoys me, part of my OCD nature, I guess, but that's how they got to be. So there's the keel, very little spring back. It's basically just sitting there under its own weight, and there's not a massive amount of curve in this, to be honest, but it's sat there very nicely indeed. So it can now come back out of the boat again, and it is actually a fair amount heavier than when it went in. I was using 20 pumps of epoxy per layer on this, so A little bit less on the final one because I had some overrun, but I think I used about 70 pumps of epoxy in total to do this. So that's a fair amount of glue in there. That's a pretty reasonable amount of glue. So unfortunately, due to the size of my shop, this lamination isn't going to fit through any of my machines. In a perfect world, this would now go through my drum sander and I'd be able to sand each face down, which I do for smaller laminations. I just can't manage a timber this big through the machine, so I've got to do it by hand, the same as I did the stringers, if you remember from a previous episode when they were upstairs. So we start out with a power plane. That's really just going to help me to rip off any of the excess epoxy that's sticking out and rough down the biggest steps between the laminations. Then I can start to take a look at just how straight things are and then move over to a different method. I'll put some little tick marks on the keel there just to see where the worst areas are, the biggest highs that need taking down initially. Now, every now and then, very rarely actually, I get to use one of my big hand planes. This was actually my grandfather's hand plane, so it's quite nice to be able to break this out and use it. First of all, the blade needs a significant redressing because he wasn't the best at sharpening his tools, and this hasn't actually been sharpened since he last used it quite some time ago. So we get it onto the Tormek and put a nice new edge on that blade to begin with. Now this is a big old wooden jointer plane, very traditional tool, but actually with all the stuff I've got in my shop, there's still nothing that really does the job quite as well as this for really straightening timbers out. It's got a massive long sole on it, and actually just the weight of the plane itself gives it a massive amount of cutting force, and it really rips material off, which we'll see in just a bit. This is a traditionally set plane, so we have to actually set the blade with little taps of a hammer and then a wedge that locks it in place. There is no Norris style adjuster on this like you get with the modern Veritas or Clifton planes. But you can really get some power behind that thing, and because of the length of the plane as well, this is really going to help me to get this keel nice and straight on either face and rip the material down pretty quickly as well. So that's what we're looking for in the glue up, nice tight even glue lines, and you can see a couple of the scarf joints in there as well, which should fit together really nicely. No voids in there whatsoever, which is most definitely what we want for a keel timber. Now I can start to arrange the aft section of the keel where things get a bit wider and a bit thicker, so we can glue this panel into place and then build up the cheeks that are going to sit either side of that. So a little bit of marking out and I get that clamped into place, and then I'm actually going to use this as the guide to arrange the other timbers that I've got to put on. So I mark out the approximate bevel that I'm going to end up with in the aft end of the keel. I've just taken the height from the 3D model that we looked at earlier in the center of the keel and also on the outside of the keel as well. I'm just drawing a line in there with some scrap stock clamped in place just to gauge an idea of what thickness material I need. I don't really need to go full thickness right to the outside of this section because that's just going to be material that I'd have to remove otherwise anyway. So I'll mark out the parts for either side and then I'll just cut some stock to size for those. All the mating faces can then get sanded again with a 40 grit disc just to make sure that that surface is really nicely roughed up and perfectly ready for bonding. And then let's take a look at how we're going to mix the epoxy. Now, mixing epoxy is actually a very important factor here. Incorrect mixing is actually the only reason that epoxy resin doesn't cure, and that can be either due to incorrect volume between the resin and hardener, or it can be with how thorough you are with blending the two of those together. So the volume is dispensed by my pump here, where I get the correct ratio of 5:1 between the 105 and 205 epoxy and hardener. So that's got me covered nicely in that respect. And then when it comes to mixing, we want to do this very thoroughly. So you can see that we're going to mix this for a couple of minutes. I've dispensed some into a large cup and I'm using a rigid mixing stick. I want to wipe that stick off to make sure that there isn't any unmixed resin that's made its way up to the top of the stick that could end up in my glue joint further down the line. So I'll do that a couple of times. I'll make sure that I scrape around the outside of the pot to make sure that there is no resin left unmixed around the inside of that as well. Then once the two of those are blended, we can add our thickening agent. I'm using the 406 colloidal silica here, which is great for general bonding applications. Now, obviously I have my kind of fancy cereal dispenser, but you can also use these with the little scoops that you get within the West System tubs, which contain the colloidal silica. Now I'm aiming for a fairly thin mixture here. We're looking for around about ketchup consistency. So we've got a mixture that can just about drip, but isn't going to be too firm. We want this to be liquid enough to be rollable. Once we've got that thickened to the correct viscosity, I want to get that immediately out of the mixing tub and onto a large roller tray. This is going to start to generate heat as soon as the reaction between the resin and the hardener begins, and the hotter that gets, the quicker it's going to cure. If we can get that out of the tub and spread it out into a roller tray, we can prevent that heat from building up and we can buy ourselves some additional working time. And if you're doing big, large laminations or glue ups, you want to get as much working time as you possibly can. So I'll spread that out in the roller tray and then I'll go over to my workpiece and I'll roll that on. I want quite a thick application here, so I don't want to be spreading this glue out too much. I want to make sure that there's plenty on the surface. And I'm gluing up both faces here. Again, if you'll remember from my two-step bonding video, There are a couple of ways to approach things, but when there's a bit of a time crunch on, doing the lightly thickened method on both faces is a really good way to cover your back. So that's what I'm doing here for this aft section of the keel glue up. I'm doing a lightly thickened epoxy applied to both faces all the way throughout this lamination. So I can get those side cheeks bonded into place. Now, a tip that I do all the time is to wipe my hands. You can see that I'm wearing gloves here, but you're inevitably going to get epoxy on your fingers. So before you start to put pieces of wood in place, make sure you wipe those gloves off and get them clean. It's going to avoid the influx of sticky fingerprints all over your workpiece, and that is a very common thing to see within epoxy work. So make sure you've got a piece of paper towel to hand, even if you're wearing gloves. Just try and keep things clean, especially in a big clamp up situation like this. If you go straight into that with epoxy all over your gloves, it's going to get all over your clamps, and before you know it, you're in a huge mess. So try and keep things as clean as you possibly can. Plenty of clamps in place on this one again. Pretty much just keep putting them on everywhere they're needed. But again, we're looking for that little bead along every glue line. If I can see that nice little even bead along there, then I'm happy that I've got full contact of the joint and that I've got sufficient glue in there, which is really good peace of mind. I know that that's going to be a really strong joint, and that's incredibly critical in this area of the boat, particularly with the keel. This is a timber that we do not want to see a bond failure on at any stage throughout the boat's life. So that's one of the reasons we're really thorough with mixing epoxy here and making sure that these joints are properly bonded. If they are, they will last a lifetime. Following day, those clamps can come off and we can start to get this aft section of the keel sized. Certainly need that, I can tell you, using these hand planes, that is killing me. Anyway, here's the keel. So we've got this big aft section bonded on, cleaned up, so you can see where that gets thicker there in the aft section of the boat and then wider in two different stages. That is a big lump of wood there. And you can see the arrangement I've come up with, so I've sort of made that flat panel, and I did this with two sections here rather than one in the middle, so the join of this panel is spanned by this main lamination that I did right at the centre. So we've got a kind of crossover of joints here and then a half board on either side. Then we've got some thicker ones on the outside, so everything's kind of mixed up glue line wise. And you can see the approximate line that we're going to come to with the bevel, so these don't need to be full thickness. So that's that, rounded off the edges. Seems like every piece of wood I make to go in this boat is like a little artwork in itself. This is just really nice piece of timber, and this is going to live right down in the bottom of the boat. But it's quite cool just looking around it once it's finished and ready to go in. And it's heavy. Try and find a scarf joint to show you. Here's some scarves. Look, so I'm really pleased with how they've come out. Glue line's really nice on them. Got this nice neat finish line, which is why I wanted to do a nibbed one, so that isn't a big feather. And they've worked really well, so we'll utilise those throughout the rest of the boat. I'm also going to do a slight variation on this when it comes to some of the thicker stock, so the top side battens. When I start to put those in the boat, battens that run through here, they're thicker stock, so I'm going to put a little hook in the middle of the scarf and do a little S shape. That'll just help these to locate a little bit better. Not quite enough thickness in this material to do this really without making the scarf quite thin in the middle here. So we'll try that out a bit later on in the project, but right now, time to get this big monster lifted back into the boat. That's heavy. So most of these fit. I think there's a couple of notches that be a little bit tight. There is a bit of variation in the width of this because of course I've sized this by hand, so there's millimetre or so here and there, so a couple of them are a bit tight. I think I'm just going to widen the notch rather than take the keel back out and shave that down, so we'll just ease those out and drop them in. There'll be a handful of those. Of course, first thing to do really is to get the transom cut out so we can drop the aft end of it down in, so let's do that next. Whilst you're watching me level out the keel with my digital level, I just want to say a big extra special thank you to everybody that is helping to support this project on Patreon. I'm actually trying to self-fund this boat build, and doing that whilst running a business at the same time and incurring all of those costs is quite a difficult undertaking, so I greatly appreciate the additional monthly amount that a handful of people are pledging to help me get this project pushed on through. If you'd like to support the project and help me to continue making more of these videos and get this project pushed on through, then please check out the Patreon page and see what you could do to help things along on there. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys. So that's the keel in. A little bit of fettling of some of those notches to get that to sit down in. But we got there. It's seating nicely down onto the stem, or it will do. And got a good fair curve there, which is good. And now you can start to kind of see how we'll shape this, which I'll do in another video. We'll start to transfer these lines of the frames up on through the keel. We'll use a saw to do that, and that will give me the marks to bevel this to. So the keel will get a bit lighter. There's quite a bit of material to come back off of this yet when I bevel this. So take some of the weight down, which I will be very grateful for. But it's in place, another big lamination sat within the boat, which is cool. Okay, so thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed watching that little timber go in place, or big timber go in place. It was a heavy beast to get in there. In the next video, I'll start marking this out and get this beveled, and then we'll see if we can get onto some of the other jobs we've got to do on the boat as well, such as installing the chines. But that's it for now. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.